At this point, we're done with all the functionality for our app. In this video, we're going to go through a couple of really easy and high impact design improvements. First, in order to really make our app feel like the Robinhood stock trading app, we're going to use a library called Ticker in order to animate changes into this text view. Here's the GitHub page for Robinhood Ticker, and you can kind of see what this looks like in this GIF. We're going to have the same effect for our text view. So if you scroll down, all we need to do to include this is add this into our build.gradle file. So this is again going to go into the build.gradle in the app module, tap on sync now, and then let's go back to GitHub. And you can see it's really straightforward to use this. Instead of the text view, we just need to replace that with a ticker view. So let's go back to Android Studio, go into activity main, and that component that we wanted to replace, instead of this being a text view, we would like this to be a ticker view. So go into the code view, go to the very bottom, and this is what we want to replace. So I'll say ticker view here. And then I also want to just update the ID and make this ticker view, just so it's obvious that this is the Robinhood UI component, ticker view. Now, the only thing we need to do in order to properly use the ticker view library is go into main activity, and we need to set a character list on the ticker view. So in the method for setting up the event listeners, let's add one more line here, which is for the ticker view, and we're going to set the character list. There's a predefined character list called ticker utils dot provide number list, because we're going to be animating over numbers. So if we try this now, so I'm showing positive cases now. I go into the number of deaths. So you can see how the ticker view did animate in this really nice way. And same thing with negative cases. And if I scrub over the Spark view, you can see as I scroll, we're getting that really nice feedback that this number is changing. One other quick design improvement we can do is to add a background shading color behind the Spark view and the time radio group. The reason this is valuable is it provides segmentation into our layout, and it gives a hint to the user about which components are related to each other. The way we'll go about doing this is by adding some padding and margin between the Spark view and the radio group time selection, and then adding a background color to those two components. So going into activity main, on this radio group, which sits below the Spark view, so we'll add a margin top of 16 dp, and we'll also add a padding bottom of 8 dp. And for the Spark view, we are going to add a padding on the top of 16 dp, along with a padding bottom of 8 dp. And these are the two components, the Spark view and the radio group time selection, on which we're going to have a background color. So I'm going to assign a background, and for now it'll just be color primary, but we're going to update this in just a bit once we define the color. So I'm going to actually call this color background shade, and then have the same color be defined here. And then let's have Android Studio help us create a color value resource. The resource value I'm going to put in here is this very light gray, light blue color that I found. And basically what that did, if I command click in the color background shade, is it added one more color resource in our colors.xml file. So if we try this now you can see we have this background color behind the Spark view and the time selection, and that makes it easier to comprehend what we're looking at. The last major design improvement I would like to make in this video is to improve the UI of these radio buttons in our application. So the default radio button UI on Android, I think, is pretty ugly. So we're going to modify it so it looks and feels like a button. I have a separate video which talks about a few of the aspects of what we're about to do, so I'll leave a link to that if you're interested. But the idea is that we're going to remove this circle icon next to the radio button and add a background drawable, which is a shape drawable, behind each of these radio buttons. So first, let's fix the styling for a single radio button. How about this negative radio button? And then we'll think about how can we apply that style to all radio buttons in our application. And I use the word styling deliberately because instead of adding these attributes directly onto the radio button, I instead am going to define a style and apply the style onto this radio button. So inside of the styles XML file, which you should already have in the values directory in resources, I'm going to open that up. We're going to define a new style here. And the name, we'll call it custom radio button. Styles can have parents, and parents are basically where are you inheriting all the different attributes of styles from. And you can see that Android Studio is suggesting for us that we have the parent be widget app compat compound button radio button, which is what we're going to pick. And inside of this style tag is where we're going to define various attributes. In order to remove that circle that shows up by default on the radio button, we're going to override the Android button item, and we're going to set this to a value of null. Also, why don't we set the text style of the radio button to be bold. So I'm going to add this style, this custom radio button style, on the negative radio button that we had. And so I'm going to add the style attribute and then reference the custom radio button style. So if we try this now, we should hopefully no longer see the circle next to the negative icon. Yeah, and you can see that is indeed the case. And we're also bolding the font like we expect. Now going back into styles XML, let's add one more attribute onto the custom radio button. For the background, and let's define a drawable here, and we're going to create a brand new drawable. For now, I'll just call this button default. And then now let's have Android Studio help us to create a drawable resource file, which is named appropriately. The root element, let's have that be shape, and then tap on OK. And so here is where we're going to define different attributes of the background for our radio button. Things like the corner radius, the padding, the shape, like whether you want it to be a square or oval, etc. So there's a few different attributes we're going to define here. One which is padding, and we're going to have the padding be on all sides 12 dp. And then one more attribute we're going to have is a radius of 4 dp, a corner radius of 4 dp. So if we go back into styles XML, the error has gone away, and now we should be able to see this button default as the background for our radio button. But what we really would like is to change the background based on the state of the button. If the radio button has been selected or in the checked state, that means it's having an impact on what is being rendered in the Spark view. We'd like to show it in a different way compared to in this default way, just button default. The way you can do this is through something called a state list drawable. So we're going to have one more state list, which is of a selector type, and the selector is basically going to tell us whether to use one background resource file or another background resource depending on the state of the underlying widget or radio button in this case. So I'm going to define another drawable resource and call this button background. And Android Studio will help us to create a drawable resource file, but this time the root element will be a selector. And the reason we want this to be a selector is because this button background XML is going to select which background we actually want to apply on the radio button depending on the state. We only have really two states we care about for the radio button. One which is the default, and so I'm going to put that at the bottom of the file, and that's what we already defined, button default. And then if the button is in the checked state, that's the terminology for radio buttons. If the state checked is true, we want to create another drawable for what the button should look like at that point. So I'll say Android drawable, and this is going to be drawable button checked. Let's have Android Studio help us. This is going to also be of type shape. And it'll be quite similar to our previous button default. So I'm going to copy over everything here. The only thing that will be different is we're going to have a solid color background in the case that the radio button has been selected. We're going to define this. We'll call it color selected background. And let's tap on the red light bulb. and create a color value resource. So I'm going to put in this gray value that I found. And then I noticed that I misspelled use Android Studio to help you refactor this. So back in button background, let's add the closing tag here and let's try it out. So by default, we're not really seeing any difference, but now when we tap on the radio button, you can see that we are swapping out the background to this darker color in the back. What we'd also like to do is change the text color. So we're going to take a very similar approach for that. Back in styles.xml, we're going to define another item which is called text color. And this is going to be a color state list resource. So I'm going to call this color button text. And we're going to create a new color resource file, and the root element will be a selector. So it's the same concept as a drawable stateless resource. We're also going to have color stateless resources. Here, by default, if the radio button is not selected, we're going to go into the default case, and we're going to pick color selected background. So we're going to do the opposite of what we're doing in the case of the button. So by default, we're going to have the selected background color, and otherwise, we're going to just use white. The state checked is true, then the color becomes white. Let's try it. So I tap on the negative radio button, and you can see that we are able to properly swap out the text color to make it white and make the background that gray color. So the next step is we'd like to apply the same style to each of the 6 radio buttons in our app. So one approach is we could go back into activity main and then copy over this style line in every single radio button. But then in the future, if we add other radio buttons, we'll have to keep remembering to add this style line. Instead, we're actually going to make this part of the theme. So we don't even need to include it in any radio button. I'm going to get rid of this line. Going back into styles.xml, this style app theme defines the base application theme, and you can customize it here. So there is a property called radio button style. So we're going to add one more item, which is Android radio button style. And we're going to reference the custom radio button style. Let's try it. So now, if we've done the job correctly, all 6 radio buttons should be updated to include this new style. There, you can see we are seeing that, which is great. Next video is the last video in the series. I'm going to do one super quick design improvement, and then we'll recap everything we've built. If you've liked what you've built so far, drop me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.